the narratives around immigration in our country are wrong. And they're not just wrong, they're wrong and extremely harmful to human beings. And so for me, that became a really important issue to think about. And it affects so many people. 11% of the people in the US are immigrants. And we're in a time where migration is increasing across the globe due to conflict, due to the climate crisis as well. There's just a lot of things that drive migration. And there's so many immigrants in the world today that if you were to gather all of them in one place, it would be like the fifth most populous nation in the world. That's how common it is to migrate.
Hello and welcome. As always, I'm Abbie. This is Stories Lived, Stories Told. And today, I invite you to join me in conversation with Karen Gonzalez as we take a communication perspective on the stories we tell about migration. To take a communication perspective is to consider what we're making and how we're making it through our communication practices. This means we look closely at patterns, context, stories, and relationships, and that we use curiosity, mindfulness, collaboration, and dialogue to create better social worlds. So whether the topic of today's conversation is familiar to you or not, the hope is that using a communication perspective will reveal new ways of seeing and being. At the top of the episode, you heard our conversation partner today, Karen Gonzalez. Karen is a speaker, writer, storyteller, and immigrant advocate who herself immigrated from Guatemala as a child. She's the author of 2 books, The God Who Sees, Immigrants, the Bible, and the Journey to Belong, and Beyond Welcome, centering immigrants in our Christian response to immigration. This conversation with Karen is the second in our series on migration. And I love this as a follow-up to last week's conversation with Dora. So if you've not listened to that, I invite you to start there. I mostly want to let this conversation speak for itself, but I do have one note about the title of this episode. I decided to name this episode Complicating Migration Narratives as I was editing this conversation. My friend Grace, who is a journalist, shared this idea with me of complicating the narrative, which was created by Amanda Ripley some time ago, and it's really stuck with me ever since. As I listened back to this conversation, it felt like the best way to describe what Karen does in this conversation, and also what her work is about in general. So let's begin the conversation with Karen. Hi, Karen. Thank you so much for joining me for this conversation today. I am so looking forward to speaking with you.
Thanks so much for having me, Abbie. It's really good to be here.
To start, can you tell us a little bit about yourself? I know it's such a big question to say, who are you? But maybe you can self-select a little bit, knowing the kind of content of the conversation we're going to have today. What are the stories that matter to you and that shape you that can be important context maybe for the people that are listening to our conversation today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, first of all, I am an immigrant person. My family moved to the US when I was 9 years old. And, I had no choice but to migrate white with them, of course. And so that has been an identity that has really shaped me in significant ways. The idea of living in this liminal space of not, we say in Spanish, ni de aquí ni de allá, neither fully belonging to one place, nor the other. And so that's a significant part of who I am. But throughout my career, I've been a teacher. I worked for a long time in an organization that was focused on serving immigrants and a specific subset of immigrants, refugees. And so that shaped a big part of my career, my professional life, and really opened my eyes to a lot of the realities of our immigration system here in the US. I think other than tax law, immigration is probably the most complex laws within the US. And so for me, it's really important because ultimately it's about people, and people matter greatly. We have a shared humanity no matter where we come from. And so that to me is an important story And so that's a little bit about who I am.
What is it about, your own personal experience as an immigrant or other experiences you've had that made you want to focus your whole career on educating or, being involved in helping immigrants?
I think for a long time, I was very focused on what many immigrants focus on, which is assimilation.
Mm,
You just kind of lose identity and you become part of this whole, right?
mm,
And this was the way that you find belonging. And I understand why people assimilate because it's a matter of survival for many people. The more different you are, the more you suffer in certain ways.
mm,
It can be discrimination, it could be othering. And so I understand that drive or that instinct toward assimilation. But I began to recognize as I got older that a more important part for me was not assimilating, but rather integrating. That is keeping uh, myself whole, not having to
mm,
lose so much. There is always going to be loss, but you can lessen the loss certainly by integrating, which means you do maintain your cultural identity, but you also become part of the whole so that you can navigate both worlds very well. And so what I began to see was one, the injustice of the immigration system, that it is very, very difficult. I know a lot of people think, oh, people should just get in line, but there are no lines
right.
for so many people.
Mm,
And yet there's a lot of labor needs in the US and in other countries that have aging populations. And so there's this sort of duplicity of a sign at the border that says help wanted and another one right next to it that says keep out. And
mm,
so I began to recognize that our government is not even consistent in the way that it communicates. Different agencies have different policies. The IRS, Social Security will say, we'll gladly take your payments, undocumented immigrants. But
yeah.
then the DHS says, we don't want you here. You shouldn't be here. You shouldn't pay anything because you shouldn't be here. So I began to recognize these different dynamics at work and also recognizing that there's this mythology around immigration in the US where we, on the one hand, talk about Ellis Island and the people that
Mm,
came long ago and built up the country. And on the other hand, we demonize the most
yeah.
recent arrivals, right? And so it's this very complicated relationship. And so what drew me was one, I saw the way that our system creates a lot of vulnerability for immigrants. I don't think people are born vulnerable. They're made vulnerable
Mm,
by policies.
yeah.
And so that became a very important cornerstone for me in the way that I thought about immigration. And then I began to see as well that how much immigrants contribute to the country. And yet at the same time, there's this within the immigration circles, you'll hear people talk about Schrodinger's immigrant, who is simultaneously taking your jobs while also not working and living off public benefits, right?
Yeah.
So this whole idea about the narratives around immigration in our country are wrong. And they're not just wrong, they're wrong and extremely harmful to
Yeah.
human beings. And
Yes.
so for me, that became a really important issue to think about. And it affects so many people. 11% of the people in the US are immigrants. And we're in a time where migration is increasing across the globe due to conflict,
Mm,
due to
mhm,
the
mhm.
climate crisis as well. There's just a lot of things that drive migration, and there's so many immigrants in the world today that if you were to gather all of them in one place, it would be like the fifth most populous nation in the world.
Wow.
That's how common it is to
Yeah.
migrate. And so, yeah, I think all of those factors really contributed toward my thinking and researching and learning. And I think my own immigrant history, I started to process the way that I had given up parts of myself, the way that I had believed some of these narratives and internalized them.
Mhm.
And so all of that kind of contributed to my focusing so much of my writing and work on immigration. And one other interesting thing is I connected with an organization that's based in Boston that their whole work is just communication around immigration. That's their whole work because they see it as this really important issue, but also the narratives that exist are so harmful. And even some of the positive ones don't have the effect, that people think they will. So, yeah, that's a long way of answering that question.
No, that was great and such great points. And I'm so glad you were able to kind of map out and name for us some of those stories that you said, are not just wrong, but harmful, actively harmful for real people in their real lives. And yeah, the, perspective I'm bringing to this conversation is also stories. And I know that is so much of your work as well, not just to talk about your own story, which is a part of it, but also in a much, much broader context, the stories that have been told, the history of migration. I think that feels like such important context, and that maybe if people did have a deeper understanding of that, that could be a new story that sets us down a path of greater understanding, empathy, better policy,
Mhm.
that's maybe more focused around shared humanity rather than, othering or being based in fear, really. I'm not, well versed in the history of migration. This is your whole work. Can you share some of those stories that come from across the world, across different faith traditions? What are the stories that we have around broadly migration?
Yeah, I think one of the stories that we tell ourselves is that migration is undesirable and it's an anomaly and it's a last resort,
Interesting. Yeah.
the thing you would not want to do. But in actuality, that's not the reality. People have always migrated. The indigenous people who lived in North America before Europeans arrived, they migrated. They walked across the Bering Strait and migrated into North America all the way down into Central and South America. They were migrants as well. In our country, we have a history of migrants. Some people were brought here as unwilling migrants, trafficked, as you will, right? African Americans were brought here unwillingly from another place. And then there were a lot of Europeans that came here. One of the things that Donald Trump said when he ran for president is he talked about how, oh, Mexico's not sending their best. The people that come here are people who are poor, are people who are desperate. And the story of America is that those are always the people who have migrated. The
Mhm.
people who were landed gentry in England did not migrate to the US. They
Yeah. Yes.
stayed.
Right. Great point. Great point.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was a lot of Irish people who came with after the Great Famine, for example, right? Looking for opportunity, looking for land that would produce and provide for their well-being.
Mm.
And so the history of migration has been that people migrate sometimes out of need, economic need, sometimes out of conflict, like in the case of a lot of the pilgrims, they wanted religious freedom, only for themselves, though, not for anyone else.
Right. Right.
And then sometimes people migrate seeking adventure, seeking a new opportunities somewhere else. But these have been the stories of migration. Quite interesting. When I was writing my second book, I had the opportunity to be in Dublin, and they have an Irish museum of emigration. So not immigration, but
Hmm.
emigration, people moving out of Ireland because they have had a lot of migration out.
Yeah.
And in this museum, I thought they had a very positive and a very optimistic perspective on migration because their perspective is people have always migrated and they have all these routes that they show where people have come in and out of Ireland over the
Hmm.
centuries. And they have these rooms. For example, there's a room dedicated to Irish people who left Ireland and who made an impact in the United States, who made an impact in Australia.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so people like Joe Biden, people like John F. Kennedy, whose family is Irish historically, are in these rooms. And quite interesting, this is the thing that I found most fascinating about this museum, is they have a room where they also talk about Irish people who have left and become infamous in other places. So
Oh.
you have your gangsters of the 20s and 30s here in the US. And, their introduction to this is, people migrate, but people are just people. And
Mm.
people have flaws and people have brokenness. People have issues that are traumas undealt with. And sometimes they go to other places and they don't do necessarily good things.
Mm.
They're still people, and so they recognize this reality. And that's really the truth of migration. It's just people migrating. It's not saints. There
Right.
is no good immigrant or bad immigrant. They're just people, and there are people who are flawed, who will make mistakes, and there are people perhaps who won't. But I think that's a narrative that really needs to change, and what really drives me, this idea that migration is very normal and natural.
Hmm.
And yet we still have these ideas around it that it's an anomaly, that it's somehow an
Right.
odd or unusual thing. And so to me, that's a very important narrative to break down for people. And also to break down, I think there is also, because people are not connected to perhaps their ancestors who came through Ellis Island or other ports,
Hmm.
they romanticize. And I remember being one time giving a presentation, and this older man asked a question. He said, my family came here from Hungary, but they came and they learned English and they became part of the community. Whereas I see all these communities, these neighborhoods where nobody speaks English, and it's just very upsetting to me. And before I had a chance to even respond to him, his wife said, Grandma didn't speak English. She never learned English.
Wow.
And, he was kind of flustered by his wife
Yeah.
saying that. But that's in fact a myth that we perpetuate, that
Right.
somehow people who came from Europe and from different places came here, learned English immediately, and became part of the fiber
Hmm.
of the
Hmm.
country. And that's not true. That's why we have a little Italy in certain East Coast cities, right? That's why we have
Yeah.
an Irish part of town. That's why
Mhm.
there's a little Havana in Cuba, because for the first generation, migration is a challenge. And while you're working, it's a challenge to learn a language. And
Mhm.
so, yet these have been myths that we've perpetuated, that somehow the immigrants of long ago were different than the ones that have come today. I'll also hear things like, oh, my ancestors came legally from Italy. There was a very popular Fox News correspondent who took a picture of himself in Ireland and said, my ancestors came from this village and they migrated legally to the US. And the date that he had as their migration, there weren't even any immigration laws at that time. So, so there was no way for
Yeah.
them to migrate legally,
Yeah. Right. Right.
But this is another story we tell, that
Mm.
those people came legally.
Mm.
No, those people were able to take advantage of a system that at that time
Right.
was very open.
Yeah.
And basically,
Not like now.
if you didn't have tuberculosis or lice, welcome.
Yeah. Wow.
So it's interesting, the stories that we tell and the way that they change throughout time, and somehow now, but these people are very different. And so, unfortunately, those narratives are unhelpful, because one, it's a myth, but two, it somehow makes it okay for you to now look at this new wave of immigrants differently, right? If you believe that, that's what you will do
Hmm.
naturally. It's the same thing with the story of immigration and crime. There was a belief when people from Southern Europe started coming, particularly Italians, from Sicily and other parts of Southern Italy. When they started migrating to the US, there was a very harmful myth that Italians were prone to criminality and that they lacked the intellect to be able to assimilate well. This was written into
Wow.
law.
Wow.
Yeah. So, very interesting. When that happened, they started doing research studies around a link between immigration and crime. And what they found is that there is no link, that immigrants are less likely than the native born to commit crimes, to end up in prison. They've been doing that research over and over again for over 100 years, and it's always the same.
Mm.
But yet, if you ask the average person, they will tell you that there is a link between these two things, but it doesn't bear out. Most
Yeah.
immigrants come to work, to build a life, to find safety and freedom, not to commit crimes. And so there's even research that shows that immigrants self-select for those willing to work because they know life is going to be hard in another country, right?
Mhm.
They will have to start all over again. And so what I try to do in my work is to combat these narratives, but through storytelling,
Mhm.
because stories are very powerful and they really speak to people's hearts first and really engage them. And then they speak to your mind as well. So I really try to start with a story and then zoom out because of course you don't want to keep it this narrow, right? You want to
Mhm.
say what the implications are broadly
Yeah.
when you're telling a story and the research that supports that. So, for example, I tell people that when my family came to the US, we lived in a very poor neighborhood at that time in South LA, and every single adult in my family became the victim of a crime.
Wow.
uh, Wage theft, assaults, and muggings. Every single adult. And there were four adults in my household: my grandmother, my uncle, my two parents. And that's because one, we live in this neighborhood that's under resourced, right? And then two, also, immigrants are known for carrying cash because a lot of immigrants are not allowed to have bank accounts unless you have a proper, federal ID or state ID. And so that's commonly known. Immigrants work, immigrants carry cash. So they became victims. So I tell this story about what happened one time when my siblings and I were out with my grandma. We were little kids, and my somebody attempted to assault my grandma and take her purse. And then I tell the story of, in fact, it isn't true that immigrants commit crimes, but it is true that immigrants are more likely to be victims of crimes. And in fact, it's such a true narrative that the US government has recognized it. And there is a visa specifically for people who are immigrants who've become victims of crime in order to encourage them to cooperate with filing a police report and
Mm.
prosecuting the people who harm them. And so that's how much it's false. So for someone to say, to
Right.
link immigration and crime and to not recognize, well, why do we need this visa then?
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
Right. And
Yeah.
so that's what I did. I told that story, but then I zoomed out to talk about all the research and what it shows, and the fact that immigrants are made vulnerable. And so, because of that, they're more likely to become victims. And I mean, it's all kinds of things you wouldn't expect. Like, for example, immigrants typically do the work nobody else wants to do. So, in my city, Baltimore, before the pandemic, I think that's probably changed with the pandemic. A lot of the work they were doing, for example, cleaning office buildings downtown after the people who work in the daytime leave, right? But think about that kind of work. You're a woman, you're alone on this, it's dark, and you're alone working on this floor, vacuuming, emptying garbage, cleaning. Anybody could come in and hurt you, and who would hear you, right? So, a very common crime is that women who work in agriculture, women who work in these isolated cleaning situations,
Mm.
often become victims of sexual assault
Wow.
because of the very isolation of their work. So well, here they are doing work that the rest of us don't want to do, and on top of that, it's work that puts them at risk. So, so again, these are things that are not well known. For example,
Yeah.
how often wage theft happens, that immigrants are promised a certain wage. Even people who are documented suffer
Mhm.
suffer this situation. And so I tell these stories because I want people to recognize how common these issues are, to combat the false narratives. So one of
Mhm.
the things I've learned, for example, when you're sharing or communicating about immigration is you should never share myths and then facts, because what they found is that people generally only remember the myths.
Mm.
So one of the things that I do is I only share the facts. So
Yeah,
I will
yeah.
start saying immigrants today are no different than the ones that came generations ago. Same need, same humanity. But what's changed? Okay, well, what's changed is the system for migrating in. That has changed. And
Mhm.
so that has created people who are undocumented, and being undocumented leads to being invisible and to being vulnerable.
Wow. Yeah. I'm, wish I had something more eloquent to say, but I just keep saying wow, because even speaking to you for, 20 minutes already, I'm learning so much and, broadening my own understanding again of this so important context around migration and hearing new stories. And I wish I had a better understanding of what I'm hearing you describe in the way that we kind of manipulate our stories to serve our purposes. And again, I see a real root of that being fear
Hmm.
in terms of literally just making up stories, or people, especially people that are actively perpetuating these false stories because it serves them in some way.
Yeah, and that's a huge, when Donald Trump ran for president the first time, he shared a story about a young woman in Iowa who had been out jogging, and she was attacked and she was murdered. And the man who was accused of the crime was an undocumented immigrant that worked in agriculture locally. And he made this whole narrative about, see, this is what immigration
Mhm.
does. This is what immigration causes. This man was undocumented, and look what he did. He sexually assaulted this young woman and he took her life. And it was really interesting because when I look at that story, it's not a story of immigration. It's a story about toxic masculinity. It's a story about men who feel entitled to women's bodies.
Mm.
And immigration has nothing to do with that. He happened to be an immigrant.
Yes.
But if every immigrant left the US tomorrow, would women be completely safe? No, because
No.
this
Yeah.
kind of toxic masculinity would still exist. There would still be men who feel this way. And so to me, he made the story about something that it was not about entirely. And her family
Mhm.
was very upset by his
Yeah.
narrative because they felt like she was being used now as a political pawn,
Yeah.
right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So yeah, so I don't shy away from things that have been done by immigrants, because I think it's important to not shy away from some of the things that are
Yeah.
negative or that seem to affect the issue negatively. But it is important to tell the right story as
Hmm.
well
Yeah.
about these things.
Yeah. And that makes so much sense to me too, that because the argument for what I see is kind of the dominant story in a lot of the United States, at least, of like just a general fear around immigration, and you hear more bad stories that, like you're saying, connect immigrants and crime. And as you've educated me today, just literally making up statistics that research in fact confirms the opposite of. And yeah, interesting to think that just saying something for whatever reason, maybe it's a little bit technology. There is just so much false information out there. And so people will hear a story and don't know to think critically about it or to even question it. So someone like Donald Trump can shape a narrative to serve his own purposes. So it's interesting to think about the effects of the stories we do hear, but also the effects of the stories we don't hear. For example, in thinking about our conversation, I live in Indiana, and I think so many people that live in my region of the United States, it's really easy to forget about immigration and the realities of it, and a little bit of what we've already said, kind of like the humanity, like the human people and their real lives that are, affected by immigration because they're immigrating. That when we're not hearing stories like the ones you're telling that are, I see it as serving a purpose of kind of like humanizing immigration, then that shapes us too. The lack of stories that we're hearing
Mhm.
shapes us in its own way as much, or in a different way, but, in an equally kind of powerful way as the stories that we do hear.
Yeah. And it's interesting, there was a woman who wrote a book called American Dirt, and it was about her story of writing about immigrations. Now, she lives in New York. There's no connection to Mexico, which
Mm,
she was writing about in this book. But she says she came to research and tell a story. And to me, there are stories that are not helpful.
hmm.
And I found her story because a lot of people, she received a seven-figure deal for this book and it became Oprah's book club.
Oh, wow.
And so it is a story that a lot of people have read and believe. But to me, what's not helpful about those kind of stories, when you have someone so disconnected from the immigrant community telling a story like this, is that then you have stories about immigrants who don't have agency, immigrants who only have needs, immigrants who are just desperate and who have no choice. And the thing about migration is it is a choice to migrate. There are people who do not migrate. There are
Yeah,
people in
right.
Syria still today,
Hmm.
that have not migrated. And so it is always a choice. And it's true that when people arrive, particularly refugees, they have needs. They may have a need to learn a language. Perhaps they have a need to receive retraining for work, and they may have trauma as well, and they may need
Hmm.
counseling and support to work through
Absolutely.
that. But they're human beings, and so they also have gifts. They also have talents. They have intelligence. They have skills that they brought that they perhaps knew they practiced in their own country, and so that's not a whole story to talk about when we know when the narrative changed during Donald Trump's presidency around refugees. It became this narrative of, oh, these are people coming to sort of, suck the life out of our country, use up resources. And so the narratives that people perpetuate about refugees are not helpful either, even when they're pro refugees and pro
Yeah.
welcoming. And
Hmm.
you have to respect people's full humanity.
Right.
Um, so I remember in the organization that I worked for, there was a group of women who came from Saudi Arabia. They came as refugees with their families. I believe it was a political situation under which they came as refugees. And none of the women were able to read or write because they had never gone to school. They were not allowed to.
Hmm.
There were a lot of restrictions on their lives. They came from rural areas as well. But it was really interesting because these women came together with the support of the organization, and they were able to start a sewing and alterations business because they were, in fact, very gifted at
Hmm.
sewing.
Mm.
They could even sew without a pattern. They could look at something and be able to cut it and sew it
Wow.
together. And so this is what I mean when people have gifts and skills, they're not just vulnerable, they're not just fleeing, they're not just desperate. All those things may be true, and especially in the beginning for a time, but they also have other things to offer. And this
Hmm.
is what's often left out of the conversation is, the previous organization where I worked, one of the reasons I left is that it was faith-based. And one of the things I didn't like is that often immigrants were seen as projects for missions, for
Yeah.
evangelism and proselytizing.
Mm.
And on the one hand, that bothered me because we should care about people because they're people, not because we can somehow convert them.
Right, right.
But on the other hand, I try to highlight for others, you do recognize that people who come from Mexico and Central America often have faith already. They didn't come from nothing and
Right,
suddenly.
right, right, right.
So sometimes they're Christians, sometimes they have, indigenous, religious beliefs as well. But they have faith. They're not a blank slate for you to write on. And
Mm.
so,
Yeah.
yeah, so that's, I think, a narrative that can be harmful, even though it seems helpful. Like it seemed helpful that this woman wrote this
Hmm.
story.
Hmm.
But to me, a lot of the story does a lot of harm
Yes.
because it really makes immigrants into like this one-dimensional, needy person who's just looking for refuge and leaves out everything else.
Mm.
And
Yeah.
so So I do think we have to think about the narratives. And that's why I believe, in terms of ethical storytelling, if you're not
Mm.
close to a community, like I'm a part of this book club and we read a book about a queer Scottish young man. It's a novel. It is a story I would never attempt to write because
Yeah,
they're not
right.
identities that I'm close to in any way,
Yes,
right?
yes.
One is Scotland in the modern world, and then it's a story about someone coming of age, and uh, grappling with his sexuality. And so it's the same way I think with migration when people attempt to tell stories and the whole story is just this poor, desperate, person,
Hmm.
and nothing about, but, she's like these women from Saudi Arabia that were amazing, had amazing skill sets when it came to sewing, and in fact, still run that business today.
You bringing up that there's an excess of negative stories about immigrants on kind of, one side that's very intentionally using those stories to portray immigration in a certain way. But then you're saying that the answer to that is not to go only the good stories. You said, you're not afraid to tell the, quote unquote, bad stories too. And I respect that so much because I empathize with maybe the kind of human need to simplify things. But I think there's so much value in what I see your work is doing as a sort of complicating the narrative in a way, really embracing the complexity and inviting people in to sit with that and the tension and say, okay, here are all of these different stories of all of these individuals because it's just a bunch of human beings
Mhm.
trying to live their lives. And they're all pursuing something and they will make mistakes and they will, be victims of things that happen and they will create whatever kind of lives for themselves. I think it matters so much for us to kind of like flex that muscle or learn that skill of living in the complexity because the fact of life in this world is that everything is so complex. And so we do ourselves a disservice, I think, when we try to oversimplify stories and oversimplify people and, what they represent, I guess. I think it's really valuable the way that you are approaching this and, kind of saying that, yes, on one level, that woman's book seemed like a good idea, but again, was maybe kind of fighting an oversimplification with an oversimplification as well.
Right, and that's the thing, the nuance and living in the in the
Right.
middle of what the truth is actually of people is complicated and not always, and I've done it. When I started working in immigration advocacy, I would go to these different communities and I would always end with a story about an immigrant person in that community. And I just tried an experiment one day and it sort of woke me up to this. And I just told a story about this immigrant who lived in the community and who uh, was a very hard worker, worked in, Amazon warehouse by day and drove Uber in the evenings. And so far, so good. They were happy. Hardworking is never a narrative that anyone's going to be upset about.
Hmm.
But then I said that he had gotten married, married a US citizen, and got divorced not long after he got his green card. And this seemed to be more uncomfortable for people that it appeared he might have married for residency. And then I talked about how, he was saving up money and sponsoring one of his children at a time from his Caribbean country. And that one of the struggles had been because he liked to smoke marijuana, he had had a conviction. But since marijuana became legal, we helped him to basically erase that from the record so that he could become
Hmm.
a US citizen. And this seemed to really be upsetting to people. And one woman actually said to me, "This is not the kind of story you want to hear if you want us to support this cause."
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's hard. It is hard to sit in the complexity of people, but
it
important.
is.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I told her, I'm like, I know. I said, but I'm telling
Yeah.
you that this story
On
on
purpose.
purpose because he's just a human. He is
Yeah.
hardworking and he's a
Hmm.
very good person, in many ways. But yeah, he does like to smoke marijuana. And yes, he probably married for a green card. And then I asked them, I said, how many of you I said, you don't have to raise your hand. I said, but how many of you have ever smoked marijuana before it was legal? How many of you have been divorced for whatever reason? I said, just you don't have to raise your hands, you know?
Yeah.
I said, it seems to me sometimes we want to hold immigrants to a standard that we ourselves don't even keep
Mm.
because we believe there's this somehow they're supposed to be better.
Yeah.
Right. And what I try to stress to them in that story was no, you're talking about people
Hmm.
who are complex and who will do things that you don't necessarily agree with, you know. One of the things that I saw many people do when it came to, and again, this is a very nuanced thing, is somehow they felt like it was okay for them to make decisions on behalf of immigrants. I see this often with people who work with unhoused populations as well.
Mm.
So you've perhaps encountered this where someone says, well, I don't want to give them money because what if they're going to use it for alcohol
Mm.
or drugs or something and not food, right? And people do the same thing with immigrants, but in a different way. So we work with a lot of volunteers when you do refugee resettlement, and they will sometimes be upset and complain, like this family is saving up money to buy a TV, and that's just not right. They should save up, you know, to buy a house or to live in a better
Ah,
area. And
yeah.
it was interesting because I would ask people, I'm like, well, do you have a TV? Yes. I said, I have a TV also, and I pay for Netflix. None of these things are necessary to live, but
Hmm.
they are nice to have. It is nice sometimes to come home and relax and shut the world out. I said, why do we think it's okay to deny people those pleasures
Mm.
simply because they're recent arrivals, or we think we know how to spend their money better than they do, right?
Right.
And so that can be a way also that I've seen this sort of kind of infantilizing and not treating people as
Yeah.
full
Yeah.
human beings with agency. And I said, if people aren't stealing from you, they can spend money however they want. It's their money
Mm.
to spend, and you don't get to make decisions on people's behalf. And so, but I see this quite a lot. And again, it's more nuanced, and you hear it more often with unhoused people when people will say that. When in fact, I have been given money sometimes as a gift and I've wasted it on random things.
Right. Yeah.
And no one tried to take it away from me. No one said, well,
Mm.
I think I'm going to take this away from you because I don't think you're going to spend it correctly. Right.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so these are stories, again, that we tell ourselves that somehow we are more qualified or we are more human and
Mm.
we're able to make decisions. So I just try to make people aware of these kinds of things so
Hmm.
that they can pay attention to them. Because sometimes you don't even have an awareness you're doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I want to kind of move to talk about, I love the communication. I love the stories. I love the language, and the words are so important to me. And I also think it's so important to kind of follow that up with like, what's the action here? And so I'm curious about, hoping, people can hear these stories, read your books, just learn, become more informed. What's your hope maybe for your books in the world? I know that you consider your writing to be your, strongest form of activism. And I,
Mhm.
agree with that 100%. So for people that read your books, for people hearing these stories, what's your hope for the kind of change or kind of action you hope to see maybe in people's personal lives and opinions and the way they interact with migration, but also maybe like on a policy level?
Yeah. So I want to say, so my major hope or primary hope, I guess, is that people themselves will interrogate
Mm.
these narratives they've told themselves or that they've been told and they've just kind of internalized without questioning them. Because if you're changed, it will affect the way you interact now with people. Right. And so to me, honestly, that's the most important thing when I worked, with immigrants and refugees. I remember sometimes people calling, is it my duty as an American citizen to, I think someone's undocumented, to have them deported? And I'm like, please don't do that. Please
Yeah.
don't cause more harm to people and separate families. And who knows what you will do. But to really interrogate like your responsibility to other human beings who are like
Mm.
you.
Yeah, that's great.
And to think about all the realities, right? All of the ways that we depend in the US on immigrant labor. And there are so many ways in which we do that. 70 to 75% of migrant farm workers are undocumented.
Mm.
And so when we go to the grocery store, when we feed our families, when we make a meal for ourselves, that tomato and lettuce and all of that it represents immigrant labor, a lot of what we have. Same thing with slaughterhouses, poultry farms, all of these
Mm.
places. A lot of what we have is because of immigrant labor. And so to recognize those realities as well, conditions should improve for immigrants who work in these industries. And the reason they don't is because they're immigrants. People just forget about it, right? So I want to highlight that for people to make them aware of this is the world we live in and we're connected in this way.
Hmm.
At the policy level, obviously that matters so much. I'll be honest with you and completely transparent. I don't have a lot of hope for policy change only
Yeah.
because there's been very low hanging fruit. Like, for example, the Dream Act. These are young people, right, who were brought to the US, like I was
Hmm.
brought to the US. My parents were undocumented. I was undocumented. Now, we had the good fortune, and I call it fortune for a reason
Hmm.
because it could have been very different. We
Yeah.
had a relative who could sponsor us. And at that time, the lines were shorter. And so we were able to become documented within 4 years of arriving. So a lot of people don't have that. So a lot of these young people who are covered under the Dream Act, these are people who have given their whole lives and who've met all the responsibilities in the US, and our government, Congress, will still not pass the Dream Act. It's been up so many times and it's
Mm.
never passed. And that's very low hanging fruit.
Yeah, right.
Three-quarters of the country support the Dream Act and it still won't pass because our legislators simply don't have the will to
Mm.
put it forth.
Yeah.
For me, honestly, what I prefer is there's a lot of ways in which we as citizens have the power to disrupt these unjust systems.
Hmm.
And so I've seen people do it. For example, in the UK, one of the things that I saw people do is there are these deportation flights to the Caribbean and to Africa. And a lot of UK citizens would get on these flights and then stand up so that the flight couldn't take off.
Mm.
So they would kind of, in a civil disobedience kind of way, right?
Right.
Disrupt. And so the flight didn't take off. I've seen people do this in the US as well. I've seen people surround ICE trucks, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and not let them take their neighbors away. I've seen churches give sanctuary to people
Mm.
and have them live in the church so that they're safe and protected. I've seen people when Arizona made a law that you couldn't drop off water in the desert.
Hmm.
People did it anyway. People got prosecuted for dropping off water in the desert. So I think these are ways that we as citizens can also disrupt because
Hmm.
just because something's a law doesn't mean that it's just. We've seen that historically, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
so we have our duty to disrupt and not obey unjust laws and
Mm.
systems. And so there of course, there's a cost to that. And I'm not saying there isn't, but these are ways that we as citizens can affect change. Because I think there is a kind of hope. And I read this Christian ethicist writes about this. It's very interesting, but he says there's a kind of hope that is demoralizing, that is unhelpful, because you just sit and wait and nothing ever happens.
Yeah.
But there is a kind of hope that has legs, that has mobility, and says, okay, these people at the top, the policy people, like they're not doing anything, but we can do something to care
Hmm.
for our neighbors.
Hmm.
And so I have hope in that as I've seen that grow more and more. I have hope in people's ability to change and to really be able to affect change in their communities.
Yeah, right.
But, I don't know. Congress doesn't really inspire me to be hopeful because they've not
Yeah.
been able to make even the smallest change. So
Yeah.
that's that's where I hope, and that's what I really talk about in my books is
Hmm.
going in that direction.
Yeah. I appreciate you saying that because I do think that it could be really easy to lose hope or, to kind of sit in what you were calling, this hope that doesn't go anywhere by looking at the top and going, well, nothing's being done, so nothing's ever going to be done. But, there really is, like you're saying, still a lot of change and activism to be done. And that makes a lot of sense to me because part of, how I understand like taking a communication perspective on things is to really believe that, we create our own social worlds through our communication. We build out these social worlds and, through our communication is how we, kind of indicate what do we value. And again, like what are the stories that we continue to tell. And so that does put a emphasis on our own personal power to shape our social worlds. And yes, maybe it's not the policy people at the top, which would be great if that could, happen and be a reality. But while it doesn't feel like it is, that doesn't mean there's no action to be done. There's this kind of idea in this communication theory, that's CMM, which is, my kind of theoretical foundation for the podcast. And it's that our stories shape us, but also we shape our stories. And so I think it can become so easy to get stuck on this part of the cycle that is our stories shape us. And we feel kind of beholden to the stories that have been passed on to us. But when you can remember that you also get to, tell new stories or make new meaning even out of the stories that are being told, that, part of the equation feels like the kind of personal power part to say you go out and affect the world as well.
Yeah. And that's exactly where I'm getting at, is that we
Yes.
can't have this kind of passive, demoralizing hope. We
Yes.
have to have a more active kind of hope to see the change that we can affect, the way that we can change the story.
Yeah, I hear you say that. And I'm so glad that you have invested, your time and energy to be someone that advocates for that and shares these stories.
I want to leave people with the idea to really challenge the idea that migration isn't just a normal and good thing for people and for countries and their economies.
Yeah,
Mhm.
that sounds like a simple little nugget, but really important. And I think worth people reflecting on a little more.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Karen.
Yeah. Thank you, Abbie. It was really good to talk with you.
So good. Okay, that is all for our conversation with Karen. At the end of each episode, I like to offer some questions to reflect on, which act as a next turn so the conversation doesn't stop just because the episode does. Today, just one question for you to reflect on. What are the stories that you've been told about migration? I think this is a great opportunity as we're halfway through this series to really take stock of the told as well as the untold stories, so we can start to tell new stories and, like we discussed with Karen today, try to complicate, complexify, and humanize the narrative. You're welcome to reach out to me to share your reflections as well as any of your own questions or ideas, and you can do that through email, the website, or by commenting on Instagram and YouTube. The reason I invite you to share your reflections is to stay in dialogue, and another great way to do that is to follow the show wherever you listen. You can also leave a rating and review. And most importantly, I appreciate when you share these episodes with people that you want to invite into the dialogue. I am supported by the CMM Institute for Personal and Social Evolution. This podcast is just one of many initiatives designed to create space for more conversations that move us toward those better social worlds. You can learn more about the CMM Institute and all our other initiatives at the links I've provided in the show notes. Thank you for showing up. Thank you for being curious. And thank you for being a part of this story. I'm Abbie, and this has been Stories Lived, Stories Told.